Welcome, I'm Kazumi, and this is the first devlog in a Souls-like game I'm developing. And while this is the first devlog, this isn't the start of the development of this game. If you want to see what's already inside the game, you should check out my channel intro. Before I retell the journey of developing this feature, I want to show the end result and explain how it all works first. It all starts when the player presses a button and starts an animation. That animation has an interruption event. When that animation reaches the event frame, it will perform a form of raycast. At the moment, I'm using a boxcast. That boxcast will hit everything that has an interface of iDamageable and add them to a list. Then, every iDamageable in that list is checked if it can be interrupted. And to understand what that means, let's take a look at our enemy for a moment. The enemy attack animation has events that change the can be interrupted boolean. It's changed to true at the start of the attack and false at the end of the attack. And by doing that, creates a window for the attack to be interrupted. After checking the iDamageable can be interrupted, we also check if it is facing the player. And if it is, we call a function called interrupt on that iDamageable. The interrupt function will then play a stunned animation on that iDamageable. For the duration of that animation, the iDamageable will have its boolean is stunned set to true. The is stunned boolean will be used in the next episode for the front stab. Now let's see how everything was done step by step. The first thing I added was a new interruption event class, which works with my custom animation event system. If you want to learn more about that system, there's a link down below. This class holds a damage modifier and a hit zone, which is the data for the cast's shape. The hit zone is the box shape I showed earlier, which hits every iDamageable inside of it. Next, I added a function that handles the interrupt event on my custom animation system. From that function, I called a new function I created in my damage cast handler script to cast the interruption event. I wasn't sure how I wanted to handle this interrupt event from the start, so I played around with my code for a bit and tried different things. Normally, this class would start a coroutine and deal damage with the information given to it over a certain duration and then return nothing. For the interruption event, I wasn't sure if I wanted to always deal damage or only deal damage if I interrupted successfully. I also wasn't sure if I wanted the event to go over several frames or just one. I also needed to perform checks before interrupting, and I didn't want to do that inside of this class. This class is only meant to do physics casts and deal damage. After thinking about it, I ended up with casting my hit zone over a single frame instead of several like I do with damage events, as I think it fits the way an interruption works better. I decided to deal damage to every iDamageable interface it hits and then return them in a list to the function that called this function. Back on the main function that handles the interruption event, it was now time to iterate over the iDamageable list and perform checks. But as I started writing the checks I needed, I saw I needed extra data in the iDamageable interface first. I added 3 boolean getters and 1 function. Some of these bools are for implementing the back and front stab, which I'll show in the next devlog. For now, I needed a way to know if the iDamageable can be interrupted. For that, I added the can be interrupted getter. I also needed a way to activate the interrupt, and for that I added the interrupt function. I then implemented them into the classes that use that interface. I added functions on the base control class for the player and the enemy to enable and disable the is stunned boolean and the can be interrupted boolean. I also added string event functions, which will be called during animation with animation events, and then those functions will call the function we just added on the controller base. To summarize, the animation will call animation events, which will trigger functions on the base skill handler, which will call function on the base controller, which will change the value of the booleans. The interrupt implementation will call a function on the hit reaction handler class, which will activate the animation for being stunned. I then created the string object for the isStunned and isInterruptible events, which I will use later on my skill object to enable and disable the isStunned and can be interrupted booleans. I then created a new skill object for the interruption skill and added the interrupt event to it. A skill object is the way I add animation events to my animation with my custom system and the way I start the animation with. I then went to one of the enemy attacks skill object and added an event at the start of the attack to set isInterruptible to true and at the end to false, creating a window for the enemy to be interruptible. Now it was time to search for an animation. I downloaded some of my assets into a separate project and started looking until I found this one, which seemed suitable. I imported the animation back to my main project and then masked it as I only wanted the left hand to move. I then hooked it up into the animator controller on the override all layer. I set the interrupt skill object to match the animation state name. This is the way I link my skill object with the animation. I made sure my input for the interrupt was set up. And I connected my interrupt skill object to the class that uses it. The result was interesting, but not what I wanted. Despite the animation being masked on everything except for the left arm, it still seemed to be affecting it in some weird way. I ended up moving the animation to a layer in the animation controller that only affects the left arm, and that sorted it out. I still don't know why it behaved like that, and if you know, please let me know it down in the comments. I then went to look for a stunned animation in my asset project and brought it in. I hooked it into the enemy animator controller. Created a skill object for it and added events. And then connected the stunned skill object to the hit reaction handler, which activates it. Finally, it was time for testing. And obviously, things just didn't work out the first time. So it was time for debugging. Remember when I set up the can be interrupted event to true on the enemy attack and then 20 frames later set it to false? Yeah, that's not long enough for me to actually interrupt in. So after an eternity of debugging, I finally did what I should have done in the first place and increase the window I can interrupt in. And finally, it was working. Thank you for watching. That's all for this one. In the next one, I'll add the back and front stabs. And if you'd like to see more, please leave a like and subscribe. And may all your bugs turn into features.
Yeah.